This is not a movie. This happened in real life. A convicted burglar is walking closely behind a prison guard. Too close. The guard feels nothing. He has no idea that the inmate, Nuno Pontes, is executing the first step of the most audacious prison break in Pennsylvania history. Pontes isn't reaching for a weapon though, he's reaching for the keys hooked to the man's belt. But he doesn't steal them. That would be too obvious. Instead, Pontes takes a crushed styrofoam coffee cup from his pocket and presses it against one specific key. The guard shifts his weight, Pontes pulls his hand back instantly. He checks the cup. Perfect impression. And now, he's got a mold of the key that unlocks the path to freedom. Nuno Pontes didn't just want to escape Western Penitentiary, he wanted to humiliate the system. He was going to tunnel under a 40-foot-high wall that had stood unchallenged for over 100 years. And he wasn't going alone. He was taking 5 other men with him. They would become known as the Pittsburgh Six. Their escape plan involved architectural blueprints, heavy-duty construction equipment, and a level of audacity that bordered on insanity. They were brilliant in their preparation. But once they tasted freedom, their alliance would collapse into a chaotic nightmare of drugs and paranoia and reckless mistakes. Their downfall wouldn't come from an FBI raid, it would come from a mistake so ridiculous you won't believe it. Western Penitentiary, built in the 1880s, was a fortress designed to break men. It was imposing, ancient, and considered escape-proof. The administration was confident, the guards were comfortable. Nuno Pontes saw this comfort as the prison's greatest weakness. Pontes, 30 years old, was a career burglar. He wasn't violent, but he was dangerous because he was brilliant. He viewed security systems as puzzles waiting to be solved. Serving a long sentence, he refused to accept his fate. He began observing, plotting, and looking for the right people. His plan was so audacious and brilliant that it's hard to believe it actually happened, and you'll soon see why. However, he couldn't carry out this plan alone. Pontes didn't look for friends, he looked for skills and desperation. He recruited 2 men serving life sentences for murder, Carmen Keller, 36, and George Conard, 66. Conard was the oldest, but he provided steady labor and the resolve of a man who knew he would die inside if the plan failed. Then came Thomas Birkelbaugh, 48, a fellow robber known for his nerve. Birkelbaugh had a distinctive glass eye, a feature that would cause a critical delay at the worst possible moment. Leslie Kevin Billingsley, 30, was serving a massive sentence for assault and robbery. He was the muscle ready to do the heavy lifting. And the final recruit was Andrew Heim, 27, a skilled car thief. If they made it outside, they needed wheels, and Heim was the best driver in the prison. This was the Pittsburgh Six. They weren't united by loyalty. Andrew Heim later admitted, "I don't think any of us really liked each other." This wasn't a brotherhood. It was a business transaction. The currency was freedom. Pontes had the team, now he needed the opportunity, and the prison provided it. Western Penitentiary was undergoing a major renovation, a steam pipe installation project. This meant 3 things crucial for an escape: noise, tools, and distraction. The target was a maintenance area, sometimes called the engineer's office or machine shop. It was close to the outer wall and less monitored than the cell blocks. Crucially, several members of Pontes' crew managed to get assigned to work details in that exact area. The first phase was turning the styrofoam impression into metal. Using scrap materials and files smuggled from the workshop, they painstakingly carved a duplicate key. It took weeks of trial and error. When it was ready though, Pontes tested it. He had calculated the precise timing between guard patrols to get to the access point, use the key, and slip away undetected. And the key turned. Click. They were in. The real excavation could begin. Their plan wasn't to go over the 40-foot wall, it was to go under it. They needed to dig 15 feet down to clear the foundation and then 40 feet horizontally to reach the other side. This wasn't an escape attempt built on spoons and bedsheets. They were planning a major engineering project, and they needed serious equipment. Incredibly, they got it right from the prison itself. Because of the ongoing construction, inventory control was a disaster. They started by stealing screwdrivers and flashlights. Then, they escalated. They acquired a hydraulic jack capable of exerting tons of pressure. And then, they managed to steal a jackhammer. A jackhammer inside a maximum security prison. But having the tools wasn't enough. You can't just dig blindly under a massive structure. One wrong move and the tunnel could collapse, or they could hit a main sewer line. So Pontes did the impossible again. He secured the actual architectural blueprints of the penitentiary. They knew exactly where the pipes were, where the foundation was deepest, and exactly where they needed to dig. But having a jackhammer presented an enormous problem: the noise. You can't run heavy machinery in secret. Pontes' solution was brilliant. They synchronized their digging with the legitimate construction work and the noise of the machine shop during the day. The roar of heavy equipment, the banging of steel pipes, the shouts of the construction crews. It was the perfect auditory camouflage. The sound of their escape was hidden by the sound of the prison repairing itself. For months, the 6 men led exhausting double lives: model inmates during their shifts and tunnel rats when the coast was clear. The work was agonizing. The crawl space beneath the maintenance building where the tunnel began was tight, dark, and suffocating. It was also incredibly hot, even in the dead of winter, because the tunnel ran close to the prison's steam pipes. Temperatures in the hole reached 110 degrees. They dug lying on their backs, chipping away at the earth in short, intense bursts. The biggest logistical challenge of any tunnel escape is the dirt. Where do you hide tons of excavated earth? They couldn't just dump it in the yard. They stuffed small amounts into their pockets, they tried flushing some down the toilets, but this was risky. Too much dirt clogged the ancient pipes, causing backups that alerted maintenance. But incredibly, the prison staff never suspected an escape. They just thought the old pipes were failing. But their primary solution was overhead. They began dumping the dirt into the drop ceilings of the maintenance areas. Night after night, the ceilings got heavier, and they were literally burying themselves in evidence, racing against time before the ceiling collapsed under the weight of tons of earth. As they dug deeper, the ground got harder, and eventually they hit the concrete foundation of the prison wall. This was a moment of truth. This is why they stole that heavy equipment. They started by using the jackhammer to drill a series of holes into the concrete, weakening the structure. Then they braced the hydraulic jack against the tunnel wall and aimed it at the weakened concrete. They started pumping the jack, and the pressure built. Slowly, agonizingly, the concrete began to crack. The noise in the confined space was deafening, but above ground, it was just another clang in the industrial symphony. They had several close calls. Guards walked overhead, sometimes stopping, feeling the rumble of the tools beneath their boots. But the area was always noisy, always vibrating. The guards dismissed it as normal background noise. The 6 pushed through the foundation. They were exhausted, filthy, and constantly on edge. The tension between the men started to rise. The shared goal was the only thing preventing them from turning on each other. They were tunneling horizontally now, measuring their progress against the blueprints. They knew they were close when the air in the tunnel changed. In early January 1997, they realized the tunnel was complete. They had calculated the distance perfectly. The date was set, January 8th, 1997. The temperature outside was a frigid 15 degrees. Inside the prison, the 6 men prepared. If any part of their complex timing failed now, they were finished. This wasn't a nighttime escape. It happened in the morning at 6:30 a.m. The operation began. They couldn't just walk out of their cells. They needed excuses to be out early, before the main population woke up. They let certain workers out early, Andrew Heim recalled. I worked in the laundry at the time. Carmen Keller also had a laundry assignment. 2 others worked in the maintenance office, giving them legitimate access near the tunnel site. Another used a fake hospital pass he had forged. The complacency Pontes had observed months earlier was paying off. Guards, tired and cold, barely glanced at the passes. They unlocked the gates, and they let the men through. One by one, the 6 men converged on the maintenance area. They slipped into the crawl space for the last time. It was swelteringly hot in there. They switched on their flashlights and entered the tunnel. It was a tight squeeze. 40 feet doesn't sound long, but when you're crawling through a hand-dug tunnel 15 feet underground, it feels endless. The adrenaline was surging. Despite the freezing temperatures outside, the men were pouring sweat inside the narrow shaft. Leslie Kevin Billingsley went first. He reached the end of the tunnel and broke through the final layer of frozen earth. Andrew Heim was right behind him. As Billingsley pushed himself up through the opening, he stepped on a loose brick that was lodged in the dirt. It came loose and fell back into the tunnel, hitting Heim squarely in the head. Blood streamed down his forehead, mixing with the dirt and sweat. He didn't care though. He pulled himself out of the hole and tasted the frigid morning air. Freedom. Heim looked around. They hadn't just emerged onto the street. Pontes' plan was more sophisticated. The tunnel exit was located inside a prison warehouse situated just outside the main wall. They were out of the prison, but not yet out of the compound. One by one, Pontes, Keller, and Connard emerged. But then, there was a delay. Tom Birkelbaugh, the last man in the tunnel, was stuck. Not physically, but mentally. As he crawled through the darkness, his glass eye had popped out. It sounds comical, but this was a crisis. Birkelbaugh refused to leave without it. He frantically patted the dirt floor of the tunnel in the pitch blackness. Precious minutes ticked by. The risk of discovery skyrocketed. The men waiting in the warehouse were panicking. Finally, Birkelbaugh found the eye, jammed it back into his socket, and scrambled out. All 6 men were now in the warehouse. They quickly changed into civilian clothes. At the time, Western Penitentiary allowed inmates to have street clothes in their possession for certain purposes, a massive security flaw that they were exploiting. They intended to look like a construction crew. They looked at the final obstacle, a large garage door leading to a courtyard, and then a final door to the street. They approached the large garage door, and they expected alarms. There were none. The door slid open easily. They moved into the courtyard. They could see the street. The final door stood between them and the city of Pittsburgh. They approached it, tools ready to break the lock, but it was held shut by a simple latch. Andrew Heim later said if they would have had a good deadbolt on that, we might have been stuck for a while. They lifted the latch and walked out. The Pittsburgh Six didn't run. Running attracts attention. They walked calmly across the street to the parking lot of a moving company. They found an unlocked car. Heim, the expert car thief, got to work. Within seconds, the engine was running. As they pulled away, they spread the prison blueprints out on the hood of the car before getting in. They weren't just escaping, they were documenting their victory. It wasn't until a 10:30 a.m. head count that the prison realized 6 inmates were missing. Panic erupted. The alarm sounded. When the tunnel was discovered, the authorities were stunned. The scale and sophistication of the operation were unprecedented. It was a massive, humiliating embarrassment for the prison system. An official report later stated bluntly, this escape was preventable. It occurred because the practice of security at this institution was inadequate. The 6 drove away from Pittsburgh. The immediate priority was to disappear. They decided to head south, aiming for the anonymity of Houston, Texas. Andrew Heim recalled the feeling. The adrenaline rush didn't wear off until we was halfway across Ohio. But the brilliance of their escape was about to be overshadowed by the chaos of their freedom. The discipline and focus that kept them united inside the prison evaporated the moment they hit the road. They reached Houston, a sprawling metropolis where they hoped to disappear, They rented a small, rundown motel room. They had help from outside contacts who were trying to secure fake IDs, birth certificates, and even military discharge papers. They even managed to acquire a sawed-off shotgun and handguns. They were close to disappearing forever. But then, they discovered methamphetamine and crack cocaine. The drugs flooded their hideout. Meth and crack fueled paranoia, aggression, and reckless behavior. It was the exact opposite of the calm, calculated mindset they needed to stay hidden. The hideout became a pressure cooker. 6 criminals high on drugs, convinced the police were closing in, and convinced that their partners were about to betray them. They started turning on each other, and fights broke out. The trust was gone. Everybody was paranoid, Haim recalled. The nationwide manhunt was massive. The FBI and US Marshals were involved. The faces of the Pittsburgh Six were everywhere. But the authorities weren't closing in. The Six were doing the job for them. They became sloppy. The brilliant minds that had engineered the most sophisticated escape in Pennsylvania history were now reduced to drug-addled junkies. Tom Birkelbaugh was the first to crack under the pressure and the drugs. He separated from the group. On January 14th, just 6 days after the escape, Houston police found him wandering the streets, acting strange and disorientated. He was arrested without incident. The remaining fugitives watched the news reports of the capture. They knew that time was running out, but the drugs made rational planning impossible. They were paralyzed by their own drug-induced chaos. A few days later, the end came for the mastermind. And it wasn't a dramatic shootout or a clever detective cracking the case. It was the most mundane traffic stop imaginable. Nuno Pontes and Carmen Keller were driving through the Houston area. They were high, sloppy, and careless. A Texas police officer noticed the car, not because it matched a description of a wanted vehicle, not because the men looked suspicious. He just pulled them over because they weren't wearing their seatbelts. Of all the complex planning, the months of digging, the blueprints, the jackhammer, the hydraulic jack, it all came crashing down because of a seatbelt violation. Pontes and Keller panicked. They knew if the officer ran their IDs, the game was over. They sped away. A high-speed chase ensued. It was chaotic. They crashed the car and fled on foot. The area was quickly swamped by police. Pontes ran into a dense, swampy area near the Houston Bayou. Police dogs were brought in. The remaining escapees, Haim, Billingsley, and Connard, were back in the motel hideout. They watched the live television coverage as dogs tracked the mastermind of the Pittsburgh Six through the mud. Pontes was captured. He was exhausted, covered in mud, and defeated. Keller was also apprehended during the chase. The police now knew the rest of the Six were close. They started surveillance on the outside contacts who were helping the fugitives. On January 20th, 12 days after the escape, the accomplices arrived at the motel to bring the remaining men food. The police were watching. Andrew Haim and Leslie Billingsley left the room and walked down the hallway to a vending machine. They were buying sodas. Haim had several cans of Coke in his hands, and Billingsley was feeding quarters into the machine. They were completely exposed. The next thing I knew, Haim said, I was surrounded by 40 police with guns in my face, never seen them coming. Haim and Billingsley were arrested on the spot. George Connard, the 66-year-old murderer, was captured in the motel room. The brilliant escape was over. Their brief taste of freedom had ended in a chaotic mess of paranoia and simple mistakes. The aftermath was severe. The security failures at Western Penitentiary led to a massive investigation. The complacency that allowed the escape was rooted out. The warden and several high-ranking officials faced severe consequences. All 6 men were returned to Pennsylvania. They faced new charges from the escape, adding significant time to their original sentences. The discipline that had defined their escape dissolved entirely once they were back inside. At his trial, Andrew Haim ignored his lawyer's advice and stood up, inadvertently confessing while trying to argue that prison conditions justified the escape. The judge was not impressed. Carmen Keller and George Conard, the lifers, had even more time added to sentences they would never finish. Nuno Pontes, the mastermind, was labeled a high-risk inmate. The man who beat the wall with a styrofoam cup spent over a decade in a box the size of a parking space. After serving 21 years, Pontes was released and eventually became an advocate for prison reform, speaking out against the psychological damage of solitary confinement. Nuno Pontes currently lives in Portugal, forever known as the leader of the Pittsburgh Six. If you enjoyed this Prison Break case, check out the channel. There you'll find many great stories just like this one. If you like what you see, please subscribe. I'd be very grateful, and I'll catch you next time.